Hi, fourth graders. I'm really excited to be reading you guys again from Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. It was really exciting to read all the comments that you guys were leaving about the first chapter and how you were enjoying it and how it got kind of really intense right off the bat, just in that very first chapter. So I really can't wait to start reading the next couple of chapters. I'm going to read 2 chapters today. I just looked ahead and I believe I should be able to get in 2 chapters, so that way the video isn't too long. Sorry, I have something in my eye. But I want to just recap so we know that Brian Robeson is on a very small plane. It's what's called a bush plane. And he's traveling from New York up into Canada, where his dad is. His parents just got divorced, and there were a couple of words in there that kept repeating over and over again. And I wish I had already done our next signpost, but I think one of our next signposts is going to be Again and Again, that we'll be talking about in the next couple of weeks. So you're going to see some of these things like divorce and the secret keep repeating themselves in the book, and it's something that's pretty powerful and meaningful to Brian as he goes along this journey. And the pilot had kind of allowed Brian a chance to fly the plane on his own, and then pretty much not too long after he had that opportunity, the pilot began complaining about pain in his arm, and then there was some really smelly gas coming from the pilot, and then he started to jerk around, and then all of a sudden he knew that there was something seriously wrong with the pilot. So I'm going to be on chapter 2, and we're ready to begin. For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead, so they were super heavy. Then he looked for ways for it not to have happened. Be asleep, his mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep, and your eyes will now open, and your hands will take controls, and your feet will move the pedals. But it did not happen. The pilot did not move, except his head rolled on his neck impossibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of turbulence. The plane! Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened, and he had to do something, but did not know what. Help! He had to help. He stretched one hand toward the pilot and saw that his fingers were trembling, and he touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were procedures that you could do mouth-to-mouth on victims of heart attacks, and you could push their chests, called CPR, but he did not know how to do it, and in any case, he couldn't do it to the pilot, who was sitting up in the seat, still strapped all in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers. He touched him on the chest and could feel nothing. No heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant that the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Brian said, but did not know what or who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again. It hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. It did not dive, but the nose went down slightly, and the down angle increased the speed. And he knew that at this angle, that slight angle down, he would ultimately fly right into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could see only sky. He had to fly it somehow. He had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone beyond anything he could do. He had to try and fly the plane all alone. He turned back in the seat facing the front and put his hands still trembling on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. You pulled back on the stick to rise the plane. He knew that from reading. You always pulled back on the wheel. He gave it a tug, and it slid back toward him easily. Too easily, the plane, with the increased speed from its tilt down, swooped eagerly up, and it drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in and went too far this time, and the plane's nose went down below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with the shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, but more gently this time, and the nose floated up again, too far, but not as violently as before, and then down to a bit too much, and then up again as before, and then down a bit too much, and up again very easily, and the front of the engine cowling finally settled. When he had aimed at the horizon and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was. And he finally let out a breath, which he had been holding this whole time, and tried to think of what to do next. It was a clear blue sky day with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or a village. But there was nothing, just the green of the trees, endless green, and lakes scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying, but did not know where. He had no idea where he was going. He looked at the dashboard of the plane. He studied all the dials and hoped to maybe get some help, hoped to find a compass. But it was all so confusing. It was a jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display at the top center of the dashboard said the number 342, and another next to it said 22. Down beneath that were dials with lines that seemed to indicate like the winds and what they were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70, which he thought, but he only thought that it might be the altimeter, the device that told him his height above the ground, or above sea level. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, but he couldn't remember what or where or anything about them. So I'm going to pause there for a second, and I want you to think about Brian. And it sounds like, because this has been mentioned twice now, Brian sounds like he's someone who reads a lot. He sounds like he's someone who gets a lot of knowledge from different places, and he holds it in. So it sounds like he's had quite a few experiences, and it also sounds like he's very knowledgeable in different things. He doesn't know a lot, obviously. He doesn't know how to fly a plane, but he has some knowledge of what different things might be, because it talks about how he read it somewhere, and this is the second time it's mentioned that he's read about this somewhere. So I want you to just kind of keep that in the back of your mind to remember. Slightly to the left and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and two knobs. His eyes had passed over it 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the metal, and it hit him finally. That was the radio! The radio, of course! He had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say that the pilot was dead. He couldn't even think of it. He had been trying to use the radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, and it was turned sideways a bit from jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped to his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot. So that meant he had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot. He did not want to reach for him, but he had to. He had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought, now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset. He slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull to get that loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started another shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back. Too hard again. And the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could finally get it under control. When things had settled again, he pulled at the mic cord once more and at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his own head and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it and had seen him depress the switch at his belt, so Brian pushed the switch and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but heard nothing except his own breathing. Panic came in then. He had been afraid. He had been stopped with the terror of what was happening, but now panic came, and he began to scream into the microphone. Scream over and over, "Help! Somebody help me! I'm in this plane and don't know. And he started crying with the screams, crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down and then back up. But again he heard nothing but the sounds of his own sobs in the microphone, his own screams mocking him, coming back into his own ears. The microphone. Awareness cut into him. He had used a CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. You had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. He reached to his belt and released the switch. For a second, all he heard was the whoosh of the empty airwaves. But then, through the noise and static, he heard a voice. "Whoever is calling on this radio net, I repeat, release your mic switch. You are covering me. You are covering me. Over." It stopped, and Brian hit his mic switch. "I hear you! I hear you! This is me!" He released the switch. "Roger, I have you now." The voice was very faint and breaking up. "Please state your difficulty and location and say over to signal end of transmission. Over." Please state my difficulty, Brian thought. My goodness, my difficulty? "I'm in a plane with a pilot who he can't fly, and I don't know how to fly. Help me, help." He turned his mic off without ending transmission properly. There was a moment's hesitation before the answer. "Your signal is breaking up, and I lost most of it. Understand, pilot, you can't fly. Correct? Over." Brian could barely hear him now. Heard mostly noise and static. "That's right. I can't fly. The plane is flying now, but I don't know how much longer. Over." "Lost signal. Your location, please. Flight number. Location. "I don't know my flight number or location. I don't know anything. I told you that. Over." He waited now. Waited. But there was nothing. Once for a second he thought he heard a break in the noise, some part of a word. But that could have been static. 2, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. The plane roared and Brian listened. But no one. Then he hit the switch again. "I do not know the flight number. My name is Brian Robeson, and we left Hampton, New York, headed for the Canadian oil fields to visit my father. And I do not know how to fly an airplane. And the pilot..." He let go of his mic. His voice was starting to rattle, and he felt as if he might start screaming at any second. He took a deep breath. "If there's anybody listening who can help me fly a plane, please answer." Again he released the mic, but heard nothing but the hissing of noise in the headset. After half an hour of listening and repeating the cry for help, he tore the headset off in frustration and threw it to the floor. It all seemed so hopeless. Even if he did get somebody, what could anybody do? Tell him, "Hey, be careful"? All so hopeless. He tried to figure out the dials again. He thought he might know which was speed. It was a lighted number that read 160, but he didn't know if that was actual miles an hour or kilometers, or if it just meant how fast the plane was moving through the air and not over the ground. He knew airspeed was different from ground speed, but not by how much. Parts of books he read about flying came to him. How wings worked, how the propeller pulled the plane through the sky. Simple things, but they wouldn't help him now. Nothing could help him now. An hour passed. He picked up the headset and tried again. It was, he knew in the end, all he had. But there was no answer. He felt like a prisoner kept in a small cell that was hurtling through the sky at what he thought to be 160 miles per hour, headed, he didn't know where, just headed somewhere until... There it was. Until what? Until it ran out of fuel. When the plane ran out of fuel, it would go down. Period. Or he could pull the throttle out and make it go down now. He had seen the pilot push the throttle in to increase speed. If he pulled the throttle back now, the engine would slow down and the plane would go down. Those were his choices. He could wait for the plane to run out of gas and fall, or he could push the throttle in and make it happen sooner. If he waited for the plane to run out of fuel, he would go further, but he did not know which way he was moving. When the pilot had jerked, he had moved the plane, but Brian could not remember how much or if it had come back to its original course. Since he did not know the original course anyway, he could only guess at which display might be the compass, the one reading 342. He did not know where he had been or where he was going, so it didn't make much difference if he went down now or he waited. Everything in him rebelled against stopping the engine and falling now. He had this vague feeling that he was wrong to keep heading as the plane was heading, a feeling that he might be going off in the wrong direction, but he could not bring himself to stop the engine and fall. Now he was safe, or safer than when he goes down. The plane was flying and he was still breathing. When the engine stopped, he would go down. So he left the plane running, holding altitude, and kept trying to use the radio. He worked out a system. Every 10 minutes by the small clock built into the dashboard, he tried the radio with a simple message. I need help. Is there anybody listening to me? In the times between transmissions, he tried to prepare himself for what he knew was coming. When he ran out of fuel, the plane would start to go down. He guessed that without the propeller pulling it, that he would have to push the nose down to keep the plane flying. He thought he might have to read that. He thought he might have read that somewhere, or it just came to him. Either way, it made sense. He would have to push the nose down to keep flying speed, and then just before he hit, he would have to pull the nose back up to slow the plane as much as possible. It all made sense. Glide down, then slow the plane and hit. Hit? He would have to find a clearing as he went down. The problem was that he hadn't seen one single clearing since they had started flying over the forest. There were some swamps, but they had trees scattered through them. No roads, no trails, no clearings. Just the lakes, and it came to him that he would have to use a lake for landing. If he went down in the trees, he was certain to die. The trees would tear the plane to pieces as it went into them. He would have to come down in a lake. No, on the edge of a lake. He would have to come down near the edge of a lake and try to slow the plane as much as possible just before it hit the water. Easy to say, he thought. Hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do. It became a chant that beat with the engine. Easy to say, hard to do. Impossible to do. He repeated the radio call 17 times at 10-minute intervals, working on what he would do between transmissions. Once more he reached over to the pilot and touched him on the face, but his skin was cold, hard cold, death cold, and Brian turned back to the dashboard. He did what he could, tightened his seatbelt, positioned himself, rehearsed mentally again and again what his procedure would be. When the plane ran out of gas, he should hold the nose down and head for the nearest lake and try to fly the plane onto the water. That's what he thought. That's how he thought of it. Kind of fly the plane into the water. And just before it hit, he should pull back on the wheel and slow the plane to reduce the impact. Over and over again in his mind, he ran the picture of how it would go. The plane running out of gas, flying the plane onto the water, the crash, from pictures he'd seen on television. He tried to visualize it. He tried to be ready. But between the 17th and 18th radio transmission, without a warning, the engine coughed, roared violently for a second, and died. There was a sudden silence, cut only by the sound of the wind-milling propeller and the wind past the cockpit. Brian pushed the nose, shoved the plane down, and threw up. Chapter 3. Going to die, Brian thought. I'm going to die. Gonna die. Gonna die. His whole brain screamed it in the sudden silence. Gonna die. He wiped his mouth with the back of his arm and held the nose down. The plane went into a glide, a very fast glide that ate altitude, and suddenly there weren't any lakes. All he'd seen since they started flying over the forest was lakes, and now they were gone. Gone! Out in front, far away at the horizon, he could see lots of them glittering blue in the late afternoon sun. But he needed one right in front of him now. He desperately needed a lake in front of the plane, and all he saw through the windshield were trees, green death trees. If he had to turn, he didn't think he could keep the plane flying. His stomach tightened into a series of rolling knots, and his breath came in 3 short bursts. There, not quite in front, but slightly to the right, he saw a lake, an L-shaped, with rounded corners, and the plane was nearly aimed at the long part of the L, coming from the bottom and heading to the top. Just a tiny bit to the right. He pushed the right rudder pedal gently, and the nose moved over. But the turn cost him speed, and now the lake was above the nose. He pulled back on the wheel slightly, and the nose came up. This caused the plane to slow dramatically and almost seem to drop and wallow in the air. The controls became very loose feeling and frightened Brian, making him push the wheel back in. This increased the speed a bit, but filled the windshield once more with nothing but trees, and put the lake well above the nose and out of reach. For a space of 3 or 4 seconds, things seemed to hang, to almost stop. The plane was flying, but so slowly it would never reach the lake. Brian looked out to the side and saw a small pond, and at the edge of the pond, some large animal. He thought a moose, standing out in the water, all so still looking, so stopped. The pond and the moose and the trees. As he slid over them now, only 300 or 400 feet off the ground, all like a picture, then everything happened all at once. Trees suddenly took on detail, filled his whole field of vision with green, and he knew he would hit and would die. But his luck held, and just as he was to hit, he came into an open lane, a channel of fallen trees, a wide enough place leading to the lake. The plane committed now to landing, to crashing, fell into the wide place like a stone, and Brian eased back on the wheel and braced himself for the crash. But there was a tiny bit of speed left, and when he pulled on the wheel, the nose came up, and he saw in front the blue of the lake, and at that instant the plane hit the trees. There was a great wrenching as the wings caught the pines at the side of the clearing and broke back, ripping back just outside the main braces. Dust and dirt blew off the floor into his face so hard he thought there must have been some kind of explosion. He was momentarily blinded and slammed forward in the seat, smashing his head on the wheel. Then a wild crashing sound, ripping of metal, and the plane rolled to the right and blew through the trees, out over the water and down to slam into the lake, skip once on water as hard as concrete. Water that tore the windshield out and shattered the side windows. Water that drove him back into the seat. Somebody was screaming as the plane drove down into the water. Someone screamed, tight animal screams of fear and pain, and he did not know that it was his sound, that he roared against the water that took him and the plane still deeper down into the water. He saw nothing but sensed blue, cold blue green, and he raked at the seatbelt batch, tore his nails loose on one hand. He ripped at it until it released, and somehow the water trying to kill him, to end him. Somehow he pulled himself out of the shattered front window, and he clawed up into the blue. He felt something holding him back. He felt his windbreaker tear, and then he was free, tearing free, ripping free. But so far to the surface, and his lungs could not do this thing, could not hold him, were through. And he sucked water, took in a great pull of water that would finally win, would finally take him, and his head broke into light. And then he vomited and swam, pulling without knowing what he was doing, without knowing anything, pulling until his hands caught at weeds and muck, pulling and screaming until his hands caught at last in grass and brush, and he felt his chest on land, he felt his face in the coarse blades of grass, and he stopped. Everything stopped. A color came that he had never seen before, a color that exploded in his mind with the pain, and he was gone from it all, spiraling into the world, spiraling out into nothing. I'm gonna stop right there. I told you these chapters are exciting at the end of them. Each time we get to the end of a chapter, it gets super exciting. So, wow. Brian has had already quite the scary, I wouldn't even know to call it an adventure, but a scary thing, right? Having to fly that plane all on his own, and then the engine cutting out on him, and him, my focus is terrible. The engine cutting out on him, and then finally he has to crash the plane. So now he thankfully came out of the water, and he's on the edge. He's on like a kind of like the edge of the water, and next time we'll see what happens to Brian. I hope that was as exciting to listen to as I found it to read to you. All right, enjoy, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye.